Raphael Holt had spent $11.4 million trying to buy his mother's life back, and every last specialist had handed him the same 3 words. There was nothing left. He was 34 years old, 6'4", and there wasn't a man on the south side of Chicago who'd hold his gaze longer than 2 seconds. He wore the same slate gray wool coat every day of his life, and never once buttoned it. Across his whole back he carried a bare oak tree, roots running down past his belt, branches climbing both shoulders. Not a single leaf anywhere on it, because his mother had told him when he was small that he was a tree that grew straight out of stone. Down his left forearm ran 12 swallows in a single straight line, and every one of them had been a man who'd worked for him and died for it. He counted them the way other men count rosary beads. Now he stood at a 9th-floor window of St. Bridget Medical Center, while sleet hammered the glass, watching a 71-year-old piano teacher slip away one monitor reading at a time, and for the first time since he was 6 years old, Raphael Holt had no idea what to do with his own hands. 9 floors below him, a woman stood outside the revolving doors in the freezing rain, counting. 412 steps from the Wells Street Bridge to that lobby. She counted everything now. It was the only thing keeping her from coming apart. Her name was Juniper Ashcombe. She was 27. And 3 years earlier she'd been a cardiac intensive care nurse who could read a patient's decline off their wrist before the monitors caught up. Now she owned an army coat, 2 sizes too big, men's boots out of a church donation bin, and a rolling suitcase with a busted wheel that made her walk crooked down every sidewalk in the city. She kept her left hand buried in her pocket at all times, because that first winter outside had cost her 2 fingers, and she'd learned people stop listening the second they notice. Around her right wrist she wore a red shoelace. She'd worn it for 3 years and she'd never once taken it off. She walked into that hospital only to get out of the sleet. She wasn't going upstairs. She had no business upstairs. But she hit the wrong button in the elevator and stepped out onto a floor she wasn't cleared for. And as she passed room 917, she heard something through the gap in the door that stopped her cold. Not the monitors. The breathing. 40 seconds later, a homeless woman with 2 missing fingers was standing over the mother of the most dangerous man in Chicago, doing something $11 million hadn't managed in 19 days. She was getting a response. If stories like this one move you, take a second to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The door to room 917 opened beneath his hand, and Raphael Holt stopped in the doorway like a man who had missed a step in the dark. Someone was bending over his mother's bed. A thin figure in a rain-soaked military coat, her hair braided into a single plait that fell crookedly over one shoulder, with one hand slipped beneath Rosalind's white blanket. Augustine Pell, standing behind him, had already reached inside his coat, a movement honed into instinct by 19 years of service. Raphael didn't turn his head. He merely raised one finger, and the entire 9th-floor corridor went still, as though someone had just lifted the needle from a record. Yet the strange thing was that he wasn't looking at the woman. He was looking at the monitor mounted above the head of the bed, where the blood pressure reading had been steadily falling for more nights than he could count. And tonight, at this very moment, it had just risen. It had risen. He had stood before that monitor for so long that he knew every fluctuation as intimately as he knew the face of an enemy, and he was certain that number hadn't reversed itself for no reason. The woman didn't turn around. She spoke, her voice so calm that she sounded like a nurse reading instructions to the next shift, saying that the old woman's central line had become kinked beneath the blanket, that she was lying on her side and pressing down on the very arm where the needle had been inserted, and that it had probably been that way since at least the previous night shift. Then she withdrew her hand, tucked a rolled towel beneath the old woman's back, and turned her shoulder toward the other side with a movement so clean and practiced that Raphael couldn't see how she had done it. She added one final sentence, still without looking back, saying that, in a room this expensive, someone should have been paying closer attention. Pell moved half a step forward. Raphael kept his finger raised. He asked who she was. The woman straightened, and for the first time he saw her face. It was far younger than he had imagined, the skin over her cheekbones gray from too little sunlight, the dark circles beneath her eyes pressed deep as stains of ink. She drew her coat tighter around herself with the practiced motion of someone who had done it thousands of times. She said that, according to the law, she was no one at all. Then she walked past him, pulling a suitcase with one broken wheel, and its uneven clatter drifted along the 9th-floor corridor, growing softer and softer, until the elevator swallowed it whole. Raphael remained in the doorway for a long time after she had gone. He didn't enter at once. He looked at his mother lying there, the woman who had taught music to children on the South Side for 40 years in exchange for a few coins, now diminished until the hospital blanket lay almost flat over her body. Then he looked back at the monitor. The number was still there. It hadn't fallen. At 4 o'clock in the morning, inside the small room the hospital had cleared for him at the end of the corridor, Pell placed a file on the table. Raphael picked it up and asked how he had found it so quickly. Pell didn't answer. He simply stepped back and stood in the doorway, facing the corridor, his hands clasped behind him, and he remained that way the entire time his boss read. The file was thin. Most of it was meaningless. A date of birth, a nursing school, an address that no longer existed. Only 2 lines made Raphael stop. The first read, Juniper Ashcombe, cardiac intensive care nurse. Professional license permanently revoked. Not suspended, not withdrawn for a fixed period. Permanently. He read the word twice, because in his world, absolute sentences were usually reserved for people who had done something that could never be undone, and he had just watched that woman accomplish what more than 40 of his specialists hadn't been able to do. The second line appeared near the bottom of the page, almost buried between 2 passages of administrative procedure. It was the name of the senior physician in charge of the night shift that evening. Raphael read the name, and it felt familiar. He turned to the next page to check, and there he found it again, this time printed beneath a different title, his current title, inside the very building where Raphael now sat, Medical Director of St. Bridget Medical Center. Thaddeus Vance. Raphael lowered the file onto the tabletop very slowly, as though it weighed far more than it appeared to. His thumb turned the plain silver ring on the little finger of his left hand. Once, then once again. Beyond the window, the hail had eased, and the sky above Lake Michigan was beginning to fade into the gray of a day that didn't want to begin. He told Pell that he wanted to know where she slept. The following night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Raphael Holt's car turned into the Calumet Industrial District, where warehouses stood shoulder to shoulder like iron boxes abandoned at the edge of the city, and the streetlights had been broken for so long that no one bothered reporting them anymore. Cold Storage Warehouse Number 4 stood at the far end of the row. Inside, every breath emerged as a cloud in the bitter air, and in the middle of that vast, empty concrete floor, 2 plastic chairs had already been placed facing each other. Dimitri Ferreira sat in one of them. He was in his 30s, his hair disheveled, his leather coat still on, and both hands rested on his knees in the manner of a man doing everything he could to keep them from trembling. Raphael sat down in the other chair. He didn't remove his coat. He simply sat there with his elbows resting on his thighs, his eyes lowered to the floor, and he said nothing. A man could endure a threat. A man could even endure a beating if he knew when it would end. But very few could endure the silence of a man who was in no hurry. 4 of Raphael's men stood along the wall behind him, and none of them moved. The cooling system hissed steadily across the ceiling. Dimitri opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Raphael continued staring at the floor. Only when Dimitri truly began to shake, when he could no longer conceal it, and the trembling spread down from his shoulders, did Raphael finally look up. He didn't ask why Dimitri had sold the container route to Cormac Brisbane's men. He didn't ask how much he had been paid. He said the name of Dimitri's younger brother. He named the auto repair shop in Cicero where the young man worked on the morning shift, beginning at 7 o'clock. He said the name of the woman the young man was dating, and the name of the street where they rented a home together. He recited every detail in the voice of a man reading the weather forecast. Then he stopped. Dimitri no longer seemed to breathe, and Raphael spoke the only words that carried any real weight that night. He said he wasn't telling Dimitri these things to frighten him. He was telling him so that he would understand Raphael could frighten him, that Raphael held everything he needed to do so in his hands, and that he was choosing not to. Then he drew a thick envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the edge of the empty chair beside him. He said there were tickets inside, along with enough money to begin again somewhere else. He told Dimitri that he had 4 hours to leave the state of Illinois. He said that if he ever heard that name in Chicago again, he wouldn't come to see him himself. He would send someone else. And that person wasn't in the habit of pulling up a chair and sitting down to talk. Dimitri took the envelope in both hands as though he were holding something fragile. He asked why. The question came out in a broken voice, and perhaps he didn't truly want the answer. Perhaps he merely needed to hear the sound of another human voice inside that freezing warehouse. Raphael rose. He adjusted the collar of his gray coat and walked toward the door. He didn't look back when he answered. He said his mother was in the hospital, and this week he didn't want to add anything more to his balance sheet. The cold storage door slid shut behind him with the shriek of metal grinding along its track. Outside, the wind coming off the lake swept across the empty lot, carrying the smell of engine oil and cold water. Pell opened the car door for him. Once they were both seated inside, and the sound of the engine had filled the silence, Pell asked a question that only he was permitted to ask. He asked what would have happened if Rosalind hadn't been in the hospital. Raphael looked through the window, where the row of warehouses drifted backward like blocks of darkness stacked one upon another. He turned the silver ring on his little finger once. Then he said that if that had been the case, Dimitri Ferreira wouldn't have needed plane tickets. The car turned onto the main road. Neither man spoke again for the entire journey back. And it wasn't until much later that Pell understood he had spent that night sitting beside a man poised at the very last boundary of the person he had once been, lacking only a reason to cross it. At 6 o'clock that morning, 3 black sport utility vehicles turned down the concrete slope beneath the Wells Street Bridge and came to a stop in a line, their headlights sweeping across roofs made of blue tarps and walls of stacked cardboard boxes along the base of the bridge. Everyone knew what 3 vehicles like that meant. Without a word being spoken, the figures scattered toward the rear. The tarps were pulled down. A man gathered his dog into his arms and retreated deeper into the darkness. And in less than a minute, the entire space beneath the bridge had gone as silent as a place where no one had ever lived. Raphael stepped out, his gray coat catching the freezing air as his breath dissolved into smoke in the bitter air, and beneath his feet were puddles still covered by thin skins of ice from the hailstorm 2 nights earlier. He had taken 3 steps when someone moved into his path. She was a small woman with closely cropped silver hair, wearing 3 layers of clothing, and in her hand she held an umbrella with broken ribs, pressing it against the concrete as though it were a walking cane. She stood no higher than his chest. She looked straight up at him and told him to turn his cars around. Pell moved half a step forward behind him. Raphael raised his hand once more, and Pell stopped. He looked down at the woman and said she didn't know who he was. She answered that she didn't need to know who he was. She only needed to know what he was at that moment, and that was something she could read. She said she had worked as a librarian for 31 years at the Chicago Public Library. She said that after 31 years of sitting behind a desk and watching people walk through the doors, she had learned to read every kind of face. The face of someone looking for a cookbook, the face of someone searching for a place to sit because there was no heat at home, the face of someone who had just lost a job, and the face of someone who had just lost a loved one. Then she said that the face he wore that morning belonged to a man who was scared to death. Raphael didn't answer. She coughed. The fit came without warning, folding her body forward, dry and deep, the kind of cough anyone who had ever sat in a chemotherapy waiting room would recognize at once. She raised the back of her hand to cover her mouth, and when the coughing passed, she straightened, adjusted the broken umbrella in her hand, and didn't retreat a single step. She had hidden it all winter, even from the person she loved most beneath that bridge, because she knew that if the girl found out, she would spend her last few dollars on her instead of herself. Behind the woman, a tarp lifted. June stepped out, her hair still woven into the same crooked braid she had worn the night before, keeping her arms pulled tight against her oversized coat. She looked at the 3 vehicles, then at Raphael, and she didn't appear surprised in the slightest, as though she had known this moment would come from the instant she walked out of room 917. She placed one hand on Odessa Vanterpool's shoulder and told her to go inside because it was cold. Odessa didn't move. Raphael said he wanted to hire June. He said he would pay whatever amount she named. June told him that he had already read her file, that he knew perfectly well she wasn't permitted to practice in this state, wasn't allowed to touch a patient, and wasn't allowed to do the very thing he had watched her do. Raphael said he wasn't hiring a nurse. He said he was hiring someone willing to sit beside his mother. June was silent for a moment. Then she said no. She said she didn't go anywhere with men who arrived in 3 vehicles at 6 o'clock in the morning, that she had already lost everything there was to lose, but she wanted to keep the little she had left. She turned away. Raphael turned away as well. He took 4 steps toward the car, and one of his men had already opened the door, and that should have been where it ended. Then he stopped. He stood motionless between 2 frozen puddles, his back still turned to her, and in those 3 seconds, Pell saw something he had never witnessed in this man throughout 19 years of service. Raphael Holt didn't turn around. He merely spoke one word, loudly enough for her to hear. and his voice was softer than the water dripping from beneath the bridge onto the concrete. He said, "Please." Odessa lowered the broken umbrella, and June Ashcombe, the woman who hadn't looked back in room 917, turned around. She didn't agree at once. She told him to stand there beneath the bridge, in the cold, and said that if he wanted her to sit beside his mother, there were 4 conditions he would have to hear all the way through. Raphael nodded. First, she wouldn't accept a single dollar for herself. He could pay, but he would pay somewhere else. She tilted her head toward Odessa Vanterpool, who stood several steps away with the broken umbrella still in her hand. June said Odessa needed a decent place to sleep, somewhere with walls and heat, and she needed to be taken to a doctor, given proper treatment from beginning to end, and have every expense paid in full. Odessa opened her mouth to object. June didn't turn around to look at her. She simply said Odessa had been coughing like that since before Christmas, that Odessa thought she hadn't heard it. But there was only 1 sheet of tarp between where they slept, and June was a nurse, and she had heard it every night. Odessa fell silent. Second, June wouldn't touch any medication, draw a single syringe, adjust a single machine, or sign a single line in a medical chart. She said she had broken the rules once in room 917 because she couldn't bear to look at that intravenous line, and she wouldn't break them again. She said she had already paid enough. Third, she had the right to stand up and leave at any moment, without warning and without explanation, and no one was allowed to follow her. Raphael nodded 3 times, once after each condition, without saying a word. Then she gave him the 4th, and she spoke it much more slowly than the other 3, so slowly that every word seemed to fall separately onto the concrete. She said he wasn't allowed to investigate who she was. No files, no acquaintances at the courthouse, no one reading about the last 3 years of her life. She said those 3 years belonged to her, that they were the only thing left that was truly hers, and she wouldn't allow anyone to spread them across some table and then fold them away again. She said that if he wanted to know something, he could ask her, and she would answer, or she wouldn't, but that choice belonged to her. Raphael stood still. Cold mist gathered on the shoulders of his coat. Inside the inner pocket of that coat, folded in half, was the file Pell had placed on his desk at 4 o'clock the previous morning. The file Raphael had read twice and still hadn't thrown away. He looked directly into her eyes and nodded. He said, "All right." That afternoon, she went to the apartment on the 62nd floor to collect Rosalind's belongings, several nightgowns, her horn comb, and a leather-bound music notebook, in which she always kept a pencil tucked between the pages. June stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the living room. It wasn't the luxury that made her stop. During the years when she still worked shifts, she had passed through enough wealthy homes not to be overwhelmed by windows stretching from floor to ceiling, or by the view across the whole of Lake Michigan. What stopped her was the emptiness. There wasn't a single photograph on the walls. Not one. In the kitchen, she opened a cabinet and found a cast-iron skillet with the price tag still stuck to the bottom. Then Raphael opened the door at the end of the hallway, and beyond it was a room preserved the way people preserve a museum gallery after it has closed, and in the center stood a gleaming black grand piano without a speck of dust or a single fingerprint upon it. June walked over and lifted the keyboard cover. She didn't play. She only looked. He said his mother had played it 3 times. He said that after the 3rd time, she had risen from the bench and told him she missed the old piano on the south side, the one with yellowed keys that sat half a step out of tune, the one she had used to teach students for 40 years. He said that all those years, he had believed she didn't understand how much the piano he bought for her was worth. June lowered the keyboard cover gently with her right hand. She said Rosalind understood. She simply didn't need it. She began her shift the following day, and the first thing she did was pull the chair out of the corner and place it beside the bed, close enough that if Rosalind opened her eyes, she wouldn't have to turn her head to search for someone. On the 3rd day, June discovered something none of the more than 40 specialists had ever recorded in their notes. The old woman didn't respond to voices. People had called her name hundreds of times, read newspapers aloud to her, and played recordings of her son speaking, yet she remained still as a closed door. But that afternoon, June borrowed a small speaker from the nurse coming on for the next shift, an old blue plastic thing worth only a few dollars, and played a piano piece. Rosalind Holt's right index finger lifted from the bedsheet by the width of a knuckle, then lowered again. Then it rose once more, exactly in time with the music. June sat motionless, watching that hand until the piece ended. She didn't call anyone. She only wrote on a scrap of paper she kept in her pocket, not in the medical chart, just a private note of her own, that Rosalind could hear music. On the 12th day, Rosalind swallowed. June had spent many afternoons sitting patiently with a plastic spoon and a carton of diluted apple juice, touching the spoon lightly to the old woman's lower lip, and waiting, touching and waiting, never rushing her once, because she knew that reflex lived in the deepest part of a human being and didn't disappear. It only slept. That afternoon, Rosalind swallowed half a spoonful of apple juice. The nurse on duty saw it from the doorway and had to turn her face away. Dr. Meridian Oyalaran entered the amount in the medical chart that evening, read it twice, then looked up and asked who had fed her. Someone pointed toward the hallway, where a thin woman in a borrowed sweater sat quietly on a plastic chair. On the 19th day, June ran out of things to read. She had finished the morning newspaper, finished the leather-bound music notebook in which Rosalind kept a pencil tucked between the pages, and even read the faint notes written in pencil along the margins. And because the room was too quiet, because the old woman lying there needed the sound of a human voice, June reached into her backpack and pulled out the only thing she had left, a worn hardcover notebook with frayed corners, something she had carried through every winter on the streets and had never allowed anyone to see. She opened it to the first page and began reading aloud. Her voice was steady, without rise or fall, and she read very slowly. From that night on, she read a few more pages during every shift, and no one in the hospital knew what the notebook contained. The 24th day was the day June would remember more clearly than all the others, even long after everything had passed. She was bending down to straighten the blanket at the corner of the bed when Rosalind moved. It wasn't much. Her hand simply slipped out from beneath the edge of the blanket, searched through the air for a short distance, and touched June's left hand. The hand June had hidden inside her pocket for 3 years. The hand that had lost 2 fingers during her first winter on the streets. June went rigid. She was accustomed to the way other people reacted. That moment when their hand hesitated for half a second before pulling away. That glance downward followed by the hurried look somewhere else, and she had taught herself to withdraw first, so neither of them would have to endure that moment. But the old woman didn't pull away. The long fingers of someone who had taught piano for 40 years closed around that hand and held it, firmly, without examining it, without counting, without disappointment. She didn't look at it because her eyes were still closed. She simply held it. June sat down on the edge of the bed and left her hand where it was, and in those 3 years, it was the first time anyone had touched it without looking at it. Outside the window, snow began to fall over Lake Michigan, the light first snow of the season melting the instant it touched the glass. And for reasons she couldn't understand, perhaps because the room was so quiet, perhaps because that hand was still holding hers, June began to sing, very softly. Only 4 lines, brief and slow. A melody so simple it sounded as though someone had just invented it and hadn't yet found a name for it. She sang all 4 lines, then began again from the beginning, and Rosalind Holt turned her head toward the sound of her voice. That evening, Raphael Holt told Pell to bring the car around. Pell stopped in the middle of the 9th floor hallway, and for a moment he thought he had heard him wrong, because for weeks his boss hadn't left that building for more than 3 hours at a time, and whenever he did leave, it was only to go to some cold storage facility or sit down at some dining table before returning immediately. Pell asked where they were going. Raphael said home. He said he was going to sleep. In the car, as Chicago drifted past the windows in wet streaks of yellow light, Pell asked why now. He didn't ask out of curiosity. He asked the way a man asks after standing beside another man for 19 years and learning that when a habit forged in iron suddenly changes, something has usually happened. Raphael looked out the window. He said that night after night, he had sat in that room, and his mother hadn't awakened. He said that when June sat there, she did. He said that meant there was nothing left for him to do in that room, and a man who remained in a place where he couldn't help wasn't taking care of anyone at all. He was only trying to soothe himself. Pell said nothing more, but that night, for the first time in 19 years, he drove his boss home, watched him reach the door, and knew with certainty that the man would truly sleep. The following night, Raphael returned to the hospital at nearly 11 o'clock and found June in the hallway folding a thin blanket. He asked her a question he had carried in his mind all day. He asked why she had sung. She said the room had been too quiet. Then she paused. And perhaps because it was so late, because the hallway was empty, because she was tired, she added something more. She said every machine in that room measured something. They measured heart rate, pressure, the amount of oxygen in the blood, every small thing inside a human body. But there wasn't a single machine that could measure loneliness. She said 3 years of working night shifts in intensive care had taught her that loneliness killed people just as surely as illness did. Only it killed more slowly, and because it was slow, no one ever wrote it into a medical chart. Raphael stood there for a long time. Then he said thank you, and he left. At that same moment, on the other side of the city, in an office overlooking Bronzeville, Cormac Brisbane was reading a sheet of paper that had been placed before him. Brisbane wasn't the kind of man who relied on clubs or fists. He was 57 years old, wore tailored suits and reading glasses, and in 15 years of competing with Raphael Holt, he had never ordered anyone to beat another man. He didn't need to. He had learned very early that in this country there was a weapon more powerful than any other, and it lived inside official forms, in calls made to the right person, in complaints written with precisely the right words. The paper in front of him was a copy of the 9th floor duty schedule at St. Bridget Medical Center, and one name on it didn't belong to the hospital staff. He had ordered someone to investigate that name, and what they found made him remove his glasses, wipe them with the edge of his jacket, and sit motionless for a very long time with the expression of a man who had just been handed something he hadn't dared hope for. The following morning, Pell placed a copy of that same paper on Raphael's desk. He said Brisbane knew. He said Brisbane knew Raphael Holt was allowing a woman whose nursing license had been revoked to sit beside a patient in an intensive care unit, and in the state of Illinois, that wasn't merely an internal hospital matter. Raphael read the paper. He said nothing. Pell continued, and his voice dropped lower. He said the move was perfect, and he used that exact word, perfect, because it didn't target Raphael at all. No one was touching him. No one was touching the organization. There was nothing to retaliate against, no one to visit, no cold storage facility where a chair could be pulled out and a conversation begun. It targeted her. And it was entirely legal. Pell spoke his final sentence after he had risen and reached the door. He said Brisbane didn't need to win. He only needed to make her leave. Raphael remained alone in the small room at the end of the 9th floor hallway, the paper still lying open before him, while his thumb turned the silver ring on his little finger once, then once again, and then stopped. The restaurant in Bridgeport had closed at 9 o'clock that evening, and by 11, only one long table remained in the middle of the empty dining room, covered with a white cloth, with 11 chairs occupied, and one chair at the head of the table left untouched. Raphael didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, his gray coat draped over the back of the chair, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing the line of swallow tattoos running along his left forearm, and he let every man in the room see them. No one spoke. These 11 men, the youngest 40 and the oldest nearly 70, had divided this city among themselves and held it for years, and none of them needed reminding that when Raphael Holt stood instead of sitting, the meeting wasn't meant for discussion. He placed a sheet of paper on the table. Only one sheet. He didn't slide it toward anyone. He said that during the past 3 weeks, someone in that room had answered the telephone when Cormac Brisbane called. He said he knew who. He knew the time of every call. He knew which conversation lasted 4 minutes, and which one lasted more than 20. He said all of it in the same even voice he used when asking after someone's health, and 3 men at the table went pale. No one looked at anyone else. Raphael reached into the coat hanging behind the chair and withdrew 3 envelopes. He pushed them across the tabletop, each one sliding in a different direction, and they stopped precisely in front of 3 men. He said the envelopes contained their severance money. He said the 3 of them could take the money, stand up, and walk out the door right then, and no one would follow them. Not that night, not the following week, not ever. It was the only promise he could give them. Then he paused. He said that if any one of the 3 remained seated and pretended not to understand that Raphael was speaking about him, then by morning, Raphael would understand the matter in a different way. 3 chairs scraped backward. 3 men rose, picked up their envelopes, and walked toward the door without saying a single word, without apologizing, without offering an explanation, because they understood that in that room, an apology would be the worst thing they could say. When the restaurant door closed behind the last man, Voss, the oldest district chief, 68 years old, a man with 4 grandchildren and a family name that had belonged to the organization since before Raphael was born, set down his glass of wine and said Raphael was growing soft. Raphael looked at him. He wasn't angry. He simply said that mistakes were forgiven in this organization. People could be wrong. They could be afraid. They could lose their nerve. All of those things could be forgiven. Then he said silence couldn't. Voss said nothing more. At nearly 4 o'clock in the morning, the car brought Raphael back to St. Bridget Medical Center. He went up to the 9th floor. At that hour, the hallway was lit only by the pale yellow night lights shining across the vinyl floor, and on the row of plastic chairs against the wall, June had fallen asleep. She sat with her back straight, her head tilted to one side against the wall, a thin blanket draped across her lap, and her body curled inward against the chill even while she slept. Raphael stopped. He didn't wake her. He walked over and sat down 2 seats away, rested his hands on his knees, and remained there in silence, staring straight at the wall across from him. Inside room 917, the machine continued its steady beeping, slow and unchanged. No one knew how much time passed before June shifted and woke. She saw him and didn't startle. Nor did she ask how long he had been sitting there. She only straightened, adjusted the thin blanket over her lap, and studied him for a moment. Then she said he hadn't eaten. He turned toward her. He asked how she knew. She said that during the past 2 minutes, he had touched his wrist 3 times. She said hungry people often did that. They didn't know they were doing it, but they did it anyway. Raphael looked down at his hand as though it had just betrayed him. June searched the right pocket of her coat and pulled out a packet of saltine crackers, the small kind containing 2 crackers that the hospital kept in the snack tray outside the waiting room, worth perhaps 25 cents, and held it out to him. She said nothing else. Raphael Holt, the man who had spent $11,400,000 and still hadn't managed to buy a single peaceful night's sleep, reached out and accepted a packet of saltine crackers from a woman who had nothing at all. He opened it, and he ate them right there, on the plastic chair outside the 9th floor hallway, in the stillness of 4 o'clock in the morning. A few nights later, rain began to fall. The lingering rain of late winter, tapping against the large window at the end of the 9th floor hallway, and the 2 of them sat once again on that row of plastic chairs, 2 seats apart just as before, because neither of them thought to sit any closer. Raphael spoke first, though he hadn't intended to, but perhaps it was the rain, or the hour, or the packet of saltine crackers from the other night still resting somewhere between them like a small debt that hadn't yet been repaid. He told her that his father had walked out of their apartment on the south side one morning when Raphael was still very young, and that he remembered the sound of the door closing more clearly than he remembered the man's face. He told her that afterward, his mother taught piano in that same living room, charging a few coins for each lesson, and she kept a tin box on top of the piano for the children to put their money into, and if one of them had nothing, that child simply sat down and played, because she never looked inside the box while they were there. He told her there were evenings when his mother sat at the kitchen table and counted the money in that tin box twice, then 3 times, as though the next count might somehow produce a different result from the one before it. He said he had built all of this, everything, 1 piece at a time, so she would never again have to count loose change at a kitchen table. Then he was silent for a long while. He said he had bought her everything in the world, except the one thing she had truly needed. June said nothing. She looked down at the 2 hands resting in her lap. Then she began to speak, and her voice was flat, neither rising nor falling, the voice of someone who had told this story inside her own mind so many times that it had worn smooth, and there was no longer any place left for her to stumble. She said she had once had a daughter. The girl's name was Marlowe. She spoke the name once, and didn't say it again for the rest of the story. She told him about a winter when the 2 of them lived in a car. She said she would turn on the heater for 10 minutes every hour, then switch it off to save gas, and during the 8 or 9 minutes between each time, she would sing to the girl so she wouldn't notice the cold. She said the child laughed often. She said she laughed so much that there were mornings when June sat behind the steering wheel and couldn't understand why. Then she said the sentence Raphael would hear again in his mind on many nights afterward. She said children don't know they're poor. They only know their mother is there, and there is singing inside the car. Then she told him about a Tuesday afternoon. She said they came at around 3 o'clock. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, neatly dressed and wearing clean shoes. They were very polite. They knocked on the car window instead of pounding on it. They gave their full names, showed her their identification cards, and waited for her to finish reading them before putting them away. They had every document they needed, and every page was correct, with the right stamp, the right signature, and the right provision. They explained each step, asked whether she understood, and when she said she did, they nodded. The woman even asked whether June needed a glass of water. June stopped there. Then she said the most painful part hadn't been that afternoon. The most painful part was that for the next 3 years, she couldn't find a single person to hate. No one had done anything wrong. Everyone had simply done the part they were supposed to do. She said she had turned the memory over and over in her mind through thousands of nights, searching for someone who had made one mistake, and she had never found anyone. She said that in the end, the only thing left to her was a bag. They called it a return belongings bag. Inside were a few small things, and one red shoelace. She lifted her right wrist just slightly, enough for the lace to appear beneath her sleeve, then lowered it again. She said nothing more about it. Raphael was about to ask. He had already opened his mouth to speak, but June shook her head very gently and said she couldn't tell the rest. She said she couldn't tell it yet. She said the words twice, the second time more softly than the first, and in that softening there was something that still hadn't been opened, something lying deeper than everything she had already told him. Raphael didn't ask again. He stood, removed the gray wool coat he had never buttoned in his life, and placed it over her shoulders. He didn't say a word. Then he sat down again, 2 seats away, and the two of them remained there in silence until morning came and the rain began to ease. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, and perhaps that was the worst part, that it didn't happen at night or in the middle of a storm, but at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, when the 9th floor hallway was filled with daylight and the smell of food from the patients' meal carts. June had just stepped out of room 917, holding an empty water pitcher, when a man moved into the middle of the corridor and blocked her path. He was in his 60s, tall, with silver hair combed neatly back, a spotless white coat, and a badge over the left side of his chest bearing the title Medical Director. June stopped. The water pitcher in her hand suddenly felt heavier. Thaddeus Vance smiled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appear displeased in the slightest. He said he was very sorry for everything that had happened to her, that it had been a regrettable matter, and that he still thought about it. And he spoke in the tone of a man offering condolences for a distant death. Then he said, she surely understood that she shouldn't be there. He spoke the word understood, softly, graciously, as though he were asking her to help him with some small inconvenience. He said the hospital was a regulated institution, with inspectors and liability insurance, and that her presence placed everyone in a difficult position, including the colleagues who were being kind to her. He said he believed she was a reasonable woman. June didn't argue with a single word. She didn't speak about her license, didn't speak about the night she had been summoned into the conference room, and didn't speak about the 3 years she had spent on the streets. She only looked at him and asked one question. She asked whether he remembered the old man's name. Vance blinked. The smile remained on his face, but it was no longer connected to anything behind it. He asked whom she meant. June said the patient. That night, did he remember the name? And Thaddeus Vance stood there in the brightly lit hallway, facing the woman whose life his own had crossed only once, and he didn't remember. She saw it in the half-second before he could say anything, saw the emptiness open behind his eyes, and she understood that the name had never been inside him in the first place for him to forget. She said the old man's name. She said Harold Kettleman. She said he was 78 years old. She said he liked to play chess, that his son had brought him a small magnetic chessboard, and he kept it on the table beside his bed. That every night when she passed his room during her shift, he would raise a hand and ask whether she knew how to play. She said she didn't. She said she had meant to ask him to teach her. Then she spoke the final sentence, and her voice still didn't rise at all. She said that for the past 3 years, she had remembered it every single day. Every day. Vance opened his mouth, but June had already walked past him. She continued straight ahead, not quickly, the empty water pitcher still in her hand, past the nurse's station, past 2 carts, toward the metal door at the end of the hallway marked emergency exit. She pushed it open. She stepped into the cold concrete stairwell, where every sound rose and then fell back down, and she sank onto the 3rd step from the top, set the water pitcher beside her, and cried. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling, one hand pressed over her mouth, the kind of crying that belonged to someone who had practiced holding it in for so long that she no longer knew how to cry aloud. During those 3 years, she had slept beneath a bridge, been turned away from 2 shelters, and stood in line outside a soup kitchen in the snow without shedding a single tear. But the name Harold Kettleman had lived inside her for 3 years without anyone ever speaking it with her. And now she had finally said it aloud in front of the one person in the world who should have remembered it, and that person hadn't. The stairwell door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. Footsteps descended 4 steps and stopped. Raphael Holt sat down on a step some distance from her, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes lowered toward the concrete floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't reach for her. He didn't ask who had done what. He simply sat there in the cold stairwell, and he remained long enough for her to understand that he wouldn't stand before she did. Much later, when her breathing had steadied, June wiped her face with her sleeve, picked up the water pitcher, and rose. He stood as well, and the two of them walked back into the hallway without either one saying anything about what had just happened. 3 days later, June went looking for him with Rosalind's leather-bound music notebook in her hands. The old woman had begun moving her fingers to the music more often, and June wanted to ask whether he remembered which piece his mother had played most, so she could choose the right one. Someone told her he was in the small room at the end of the hallway that the hospital had set aside for him. The door was partly closed. She raised her hand to knock, and then she heard his voice. She had heard Raphael speak many times over the past several weeks, when he was tired, when he was asking questions, when he was telling her about the tin box on top of the piano. This wasn't that voice. This voice had no warmth in it. It didn't rise, and it didn't harden. It simply moved straight ahead, like something made of metal being set down on a table. He was speaking to Pell on the telephone. He said to pay the man the amount they had agreed upon, and tell him to keep quiet. He said that if the man demanded more, then give him more, however much it took, and don't call back to ask. He said that if the man took the money and still opened his mouth, the matter would be handled another way. And he spoke that last part more softly than the first two, as lightly as someone discussing tomorrow's weather. Then he paused, probably listening to something Pell said on the other end, and answered with one brief sentence. He said everyone had a price. He said Pell's job was to find that price, not to ask whether he should be looking for it. He ended the call. June was still standing in the doorway with the leather-bound notebook held against her chest, and she didn't have time to step back. Raphael looked up and saw her. He didn't startle. He didn't rise. He didn't tell her she had misunderstood, didn't say the situation wasn't what she thought, and didn't soften his voice to make any part of it easier. He simply placed the telephone on the table and looked at her. And that look told her he knew she had heard everything, and that he wouldn't apologize for it. June stood there for a very long time. She thought about the packet of saltine crackers. She thought about the gray coat he had placed over her shoulders on that rainy night. She thought about the man who had sat in the concrete stairwell without speaking a single word until she was able to stand, and she thought about the voice she had just heard through the narrow opening of the door, and she tried to fit those two things together into one person, but she couldn't. She stepped into the room and placed the music notebook on the table. Then she asked him. She asked calmly, without accusation and without mockery, with the quiet, unyielding detachment she used when speaking about the most painful things in her life. She asked him how much she was worth. Raphael didn't answer at once. He looked at her, and he looked for so long that she nearly turned away. Outside the window, the city lights had come on, and the glow rising from below sharpened the line of his jaw. He had spent 34 years living in a world where the words he had just spoken were the truth, a truth that had saved him no fewer than 20 times and had never betrayed him once. He had bought silence, bought loyalty, bought time, and bought things people had sworn they would never sell. He had given $11,400,000 to the finest people on earth in an attempt to buy back his mother's life, and he had failed, and even that failure still made sense to him, because it only meant he hadn't yet found the right person to pay. Then he spoke. He said he hadn't found it yet. He didn't say it as a compliment or as flattery, but like a man admitting there was a flaw in his own system. Then he added, his voice dropping slightly, that this was exactly what kept him awake at night. June lifted the music notebook from the table, held it against her chest again, and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She only closed it very gently behind her. And in the 9th floor hallway that evening, for the first time since that morning beneath the Wells Street Bridge, she thought about standing up and leaving. The chapel at St. Bridget Medical Center was on the ground floor. At the end of a hallway, almost no one walked down unless they had no choice. It was small, with 6 rows of wooden pews, a faded stained glass window, and the smell of rooms that few people ever entered. Raphael Holt had been sitting in the last row since June's shift began. He remained there for 7 hours. He didn't pray because he didn't know how. He only sat with his hands clasped between his knees, his thumb turning the silver ring on his little finger again and again until the skin around it grew red. By the time her shift ended, morning had already come, and he sent her a message containing only one line, telling her to come down to the ground floor. June entered the chapel with her military coat draped over one arm and the expression of someone who knew she was about to hear something. She sat in the pew in front of him and turned around. Raphael didn't look at her when he began to speak. He looked at the stained glass window. He said that 3 years earlier, his mother had needed heart valve surgery. He said she had remained on the waiting list through one season after another, and every time her turn came, some new reason pushed her back again. An emergency case taking her place, an operating room being delayed, a consultation having to be repeated. He said he had gone to see the head of cardiology at that hospital. He spoke the man's name, and he said it clearly, without hesitation or evasion. Thaddeus Vance. He said Vance told him the department had a personnel problem that needed to be handled quietly. Vance said that if the matter became public, the entire department would be frozen for an investigation for at least 6 months, and no surgeries would be scheduled during that time. And Vance added that Raphael's mother didn't have 6 months. Raphael said he signed a check that same evening. June didn't move. He continued, and only then did he turn to look at her. He said he hadn't asked who that personnel problem was. He said he hadn't asked what had happened. He hadn't asked who would suffer, who would lose something, or whose head that check would be used to press down. He said he could have asked one question. Only one. Just 4 words. Who is that person? He said he hadn't asked, not because he feared the answer, but because he wasn't accustomed to asking about the people beneath him. He said more than 30 years in his world had taught him that when an equal said something needed to be handled quietly, his job was to pay, not to count how many people were buried beneath that silence. Then he spoke the final sentence, and he didn't soften it at all. There wasn't a single word of self-defense in it. He said he hadn't signed that check to hurt her. He had signed it because he hadn't asked. And he said that now he understood those two things were the same. June didn't scream. She didn't stand, didn't raise a hand, and didn't throw a single word back at him. She remained seated on that wooden pew for a very long time, so long that a nurse appeared briefly in the chapel doorway and then quietly withdrew. Then June spoke, and her voice remained low and steady, the same restrained cadence that had carried her through the winter in the car and the Tuesday afternoon without rising even once. She said her daughter had died in a room she had never seen. She said she didn't know whether that room had a window. She didn't know which direction it faced. She said she had asked many people, and no one had been able to tell her, and now she no longer asked. Then she stood. She draped the military coat over her arm, walked past him, and left the chapel without looking back once. Raphael Holt remained alone among the 6 rows of empty wooden pews, beneath the faded stained glass window, and for the first time in his life, he understood that some things he had done hadn't been done with his own hands, but by turning his face away just once, and they carried exactly the same weight. She didn't wander. She went straight to the bus station on the south side, bought a ticket with loose change counted from her coat pocket, and spent 4 hours on a bus heading down to Kankakee County. Beyond the window, Illinois stretched into harvested cornfields, bare stalks standing beneath the March sky, with snow still lingering in the furrows like streaks of chalk someone had forgotten to erase. She got off in a small town, walked for nearly another half-hour, then turned into a flat parcel of land, bordered by a low iron fence and several maple trees that hadn't yet grown their leaves. The grave marker lay in the last row near the edge of the grounds, a small, flat stone no larger than 2 cupped hands, resting level with the grass. She had never been there before. 3 years earlier, she had no way to make the journey. She sat down on the grass, placed her backpack beside her, and remained there until darkness had completely fallen and the dew had soaked the shoulders of her coat. Then she began to speak. She didn't talk about the old things. She had told those stories once already, only a few nights before, on a row of plastic chairs outside a hospital room, and she didn't want to bring them all the way down there. She talked about the present. She said Mom was taking care of an old woman. The woman was 71 years old, had taught piano for 40 years, and now lay still and couldn't speak, but Mom believed she could hear. She said that when Mom played music, the woman's fingers moved in time with it, and no one could explain why, not even the doctors. She told her that one day, the old woman had taken Mom's hand and hadn't pulled away. She told her little girl that no one had done that for Mom in a very long time. Then she said that every night, Mom read aloud to the woman. She said Mom had run out of everything else to read, so she had begun reading from the notebook Mom had always been writing for her. She said Mom had read the words she had written for her daughter to a stranger, without asking her permission first, and Mom was sorry, but the room had been so quiet, and she thought that her daughter wouldn't have minded. She said there was a man there. She said he wore a gray wool coat and never buttoned it, even when it was cold. She said he was the old woman's son, and he was a very frightening man. Frightening in a way her daughter wouldn't have understood. But one night he had taken off that coat, placed it over Mom's shoulders, and hadn't said anything at all. She stopped there for a very long time. The dew settled more heavily around her. Somewhere beyond the iron fence, a truck passed along the highway, and then faded into the distance. Then she said the thing she had never told anyone, the thing she hadn't even admitted to herself in 3 long years. She said Mom had thought she was angry with him. She said Mom had spent 4 hours on the bus, believing she was running away from that anger. But after sitting there all night, Mom knew that wasn't true. She said Mom wasn't angry with him. Mom was angry with herself. She said that all her life, Mom had believed in one thing, believed in it completely, believed so deeply that she had built her entire self around it, that if you did the right thing, everything would eventually be all right. She said Mom had done the right thing. Mom had done everything right, every step of the way, and nothing had turned out all right. She said Mom was angry with herself for believing it, and for teaching her daughter to believe it too. Dawn came at nearly 6 o'clock. She stood, brushed the wet grass from her pant legs, rested her hand on the stone for a while, then walked back toward the main road to catch the early bus. 36 hours after leaving the chapel, she stepped out of the elevator onto the 9th floor of St. Bridget Medical Center. Raphael Holt was standing in the hallway. He was still wearing the same clothes from the day before. A shadow of beard had grown across his face, and his eyes belonged to a man who hadn't slept during all that time. None of his men were there. No cars, no Pell, no one waiting at the stairwell. June stopped several steps away from him. She asked why he hadn't sent anyone to find her. Raphael looked at her and said it was because he had already taken away her right to choose once. That night, Pell drove him home. They passed through the nearly deserted downtown, past shuttered storefronts and streetlights spilling across the wet pavement, and when the car reached the middle of the bridge over a branch of the Chicago River, Pell pulled to the side and turned off the engine. Raphael looked up. In 19 years, Augustine Pell had never stopped the car without being told to stop. Pell didn't turn around. He reached toward the back seat, picked up a square tin box, faded with age, the kind of cookie tin people kept to hold small odds and ends, and placed it on his boss's lap. Raphael lifted the lid. Inside was paper, a great deal of paper. 2 thick bundles held together with rubber bands, copies of reports, several photographs reproduced from personnel files, and pages of typed testimony bearing signatures in the lower corners. Resting on top, folded in half, was a copy of a check. Raphael opened it. The signature in the right-hand corner was his own. He said nothing. Pell stared straight through the windshield, both hands still resting on the steering wheel, and began speaking in the even voice of a man who had rehearsed this story inside his mind many times. He said that 3 years earlier, he had been the one who delivered that check. He said he had carried it to the 7th floor of the cardiology department's old building and placed it directly into Thaddeus Vance's hands, and that on his way out, he had turned back and asked one question. He said it was the only time in 19 years he had ever asked about a matter he had been instructed merely to deliver. He had asked who the personnel problem was, and Vance had answered very politely, very naturally, that it was a nurse, that she would be fine, that they would arrange a payment for her, and that the matter would be brought to a quiet conclusion. Pell said he had believed him. He said he had no reason not to. He had taken the elevator down, driven home, and hadn't thought about it again for 2 years. Then he explained the part Raphael had never understood. He said no one could buy the state nursing board. No one had enough money, and no one was reckless enough to try. They didn't need to buy it. They only needed to send the board a stack of papers that had been rearranged. An internal review concluded sooner than expected. A shift report retyped to make it cleaner. One line from the attending physician's notes, disappearing from the copy that was forwarded, and what remained was a neat file in which everything pointed back to a single name. He said the state board wasn't corrupt. They read what they were given, did their jobs exactly as they were supposed to, and reached a completely proper decision based on things that were entirely false. He said that 3 years later, no one was still responsible, because there wasn't a single point in the entire chain where a finger could be placed. Raphael held the check in his hand. and didn't set it down. Pell continued. He said that 2 years earlier, on a winter morning, he had left early for work, and Wells Street was blocked, so he had taken the road beneath the bridge. He said it was still dark, and he saw a woman sitting up beneath a blue tarp. He said he drove past her, made it some distance farther, and then remembered where he had seen that face before. It had been in a small photograph, clipped inside the personnel file he had glanced through only once, 3 years earlier, on the 7th floor of the cardiology building, while he waited for Vance to sign for the check. Pell said he pulled to the side of the road and sat in the car for a very long time. He said he didn't remember how long he remained there, only that by the time he started the engine and drove on, daylight had fully arrived. Then he told Raphael the thing that should have gotten him killed. He said that from that day forward, he had begun investigating. Not Vance. He said he had begun investigating the very man sitting beside him in the car. He tracked down every person who had signed every page in that chain. He found a retired nurse named Wilhelmina Fox. He went to her house 3 times, and 3 times she closed the door in his face. On the 4th visit, she invited him inside. He had kept everything in that tin box beneath the back seat for all that time. Raphael sat in silence. Then he asked Pell how long he had been holding it. Pell continued staring through the windshield, where the bridge stretched beneath the yellow lights and a fine rain had begun to gather on the glass. He said, 2 years ago, if I'd given this to you, you would have burned it. I waited until you became the man who wouldn't burn it anymore. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the machine above the bed in room 917 changed from its steady beeping to one long, unbroken wail, and the entire 9th floor woke at once. June was sitting in the chair beside the bed when she heard it, and she was already on her feet before she understood what she was doing. 2 fingers pressed against Rosalind's neck as she searched for a pulse, and found nothing. The door flew open. People rushed in. 3 at first, then 5. Then an entire emergency cart rolled across the threshold, and someone seized June by the arm and pulled her backward, while a woman's voice shouted that she wasn't permitted to be in there. June was pushed into the hallway. The sliding glass door closed in front of her. Inside, everything happened very quickly. The side rail was lowered. Someone climbed over the bed to begin chest compressions. Someone else was cutting away Rosalind's clothing. The defibrillator was pulled closer, and every one of them was shouting. That was what June would remember most clearly afterward. Not the machine, but the voices. Everyone in that room was yelling over everyone else, calling out dosages, numbers, medication names, and times. And amid that tangled mass of overlapping sound, not one person, not one of them, turned toward the door. She struck the glass. She pounded it with both palms, hard enough to make the frame tremble, and she shouted Dr. Oyelleran's name, shouted the word potassium, shouted it again and again. No one heard her. In a room where 10 people were shouting at once, the 11th voice didn't exist. June stepped back half a pace, and in that half step, she understood something 3 years on the streets had taught her, though she had never given it a name. When everyone was screaming, the only thing that could still be heard was silence. She thrust a hand into her coat pocket and pulled out the thing she always carried there, a scrap of paper folded into quarters, its front bearing the words she usually wrote for other people. She turned it over. She didn't have a pen. She spun around, snatched the pen clipped to the pocket of a nurse rushing past, and the woman didn't have time to react. June wrote in capital letters, as large as the paper would allow, 3 lines. Potassium, loop diuretic, 4 weeks. Then she turned back to the glass, pressed the paper against it, both palms spread flat on either side, and stood perfectly still. She didn't shout anymore. She didn't pound anymore. She only stood there, a thin woman in a borrowed sweater, holding a simple, unassuming scrap of paper against the glass in complete silence, while on the other side came the shouting, the machines, and the grinding wheels of the emergency cart against the floor. Meridian Oyelleran was bent over the bed. He looked up, perhaps only to take a breath, perhaps because exhausted people sometimes lift their eyes without knowing why. And he saw it, 3 lines written in capital letters, a piece of paper that made no sound at all. He froze for half a second, then turned and ordered an immediate blood draw for emergency electrolytes. No waiting. And he repeated the word potassium, loudly enough to rise above every other sound in the room. The results came back in less than 10 minutes. Severe hypokalemia. Rosalind had been receiving loop diuretics continuously for 4 weeks, and not one person across the entire chain of shifts had thought to recheck her electrolytes because everyone had been too busy watching her heart. They began replacing potassium through her intravenous line, and 11 minutes after the machine first began to wail, Rosalind Holt's heartbeat returned, slow and irregular, but present. The sliding glass door opened. Oyelaran stepped into the hallway, pulled the gloves from his trembling hands, threw them into the bin, and stood there breathing. No one knew when Raphael had appeared at the far end of the corridor. His gray coat draped over one arm, every trace of color gone from his face. Oyelaran looked at him and said he had just watched a woman without a nursing license save his mother's life from the other side of a glass wall. He said he didn't know what the laws of that state called what had just happened, and he had no intention of finding out. He said medicine called it a good nurse. Then he walked away. Raphael turned. June was no longer standing where she had been. She had slid down to the floor beneath the hallway wall, her knees drawn up, the paper still clutched in her right hand, and she was trembling violently from her shoulders downward, the way a person trembles when everything inside them has been emptied at once. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, wide open, and fixed on the wall across from her. Raphael walked toward her. Then he did the one thing that in 34 years of life he had never done before anyone, never before an equal, an enemy, a judge, or a cross. He knelt in front of her in the middle of the 9th floor hallway, so that his eyes were level with hers. Sabine Corvallo was the attorney Raphael had sought out after that night on the bridge. A woman in her 40s, who specialized in medical malpractice, had no connection to anyone in his world, owed him nothing, and wasn't afraid of him in the slightest. She accepted the tin box, spent 3 weeks reconstructing the entire chain of documents in the Kettleman case, and while requesting archived records from the hospital system, she was forced to retrieve related files bearing the same last name. She called them on a Friday afternoon and said she needed to meet with both of them. In the small conference room at her office, Sabine placed a thin file on the table and said this wasn't part of the work she had been hired to do, that she had spent a long time deciding whether she should reveal it, and that, in the end, she had concluded that people had the right to know the truth about their own lives. Then she pushed the file toward June. It was a pediatric medical record. On the second page, near the bottom, there was a handwritten note from a pediatrician recommending a detailed echocardiogram after a faint heart murmur had been detected during a routine examination. Beneath that note, someone had attached a response form from the insurance company. The form contained 3 square boxes. The second box had been checked. Beside it was a printed sentence stating that the request didn't meet the clinical criteria required for coverage. Sabine said very softly that the heart valve defect had been extremely small, the kind that could only have been detected through that specific ultrasound examination, and that it hadn't caused any symptoms until a respiratory infection placed additional strain upon it. She said no one had done anything wrong. The pediatrician had made the correct recommendation. The insurance company had responded according to its established procedure. The person who processed the request that day had probably reviewed hundreds of nearly identical files and hadn't known who the name on that page belonged to. June said nothing. She picked up the file and began to read. She read very slowly from the first line, skipping none of the administrative language, and Raphael sat across from her watching her read, hardly daring to breathe. She finished the second page, then turned back and read it again. Then a third time. No one in the room spoke a single word during all that time. Finally, she placed the file on the table and said a number aloud. She said the ultrasound had cost $342. She said she had checked while she was reading, because she remembered the hospital's pricing schedule from the years when she had worked within that system. Raphael opened his mouth, but nothing came out. June continued in a controlled, emotionless tone, without rising even half a note. She said that month she had $311. She spoke the number clearly, the way someone might recite an address where they had lived their entire life. Then she stopped, and she said she had been $31 short. After she said it, the conference room held no sound except the hum of the air conditioner. Sabine Corvallo turned her face away. June picked up the file. She folded it, following the old crease exactly, the same crease someone in a records room had made years earlier, and she ran her finger along the fold twice to flatten it, carefully, as though keeping the paper from wrinkling were the most important thing she still had the power to do. She didn't cry. She placed it on the table, kept her hand resting over it, and looked out the window. Raphael Holt sat there. He had spent $11,400,000 on the finest minds on earth. He had purchased the silence of people who never remained silent, bought time in places where no one sold time, and even bought a place in a surgical waiting list. Throughout his entire life, he had known only one way to respond to a problem, and that was to discover its price and pay it. He sat in that room and searched. He truly searched, desperately, turning over everything in his mind for something, anything, he could buy at that moment. $342, an amount he could spend on a single lunch, and afterward failed to remember the name of the restaurant. And it lay on the other side of 3 years, on the other side of a Tuesday afternoon, on the other side of a door that had closed and could never be opened again. For the first time in his life, Raphael Holt couldn't find anything to buy. The mobile medical clinic was parked at the street corner south of the Wells Street Bridge, where it had been stationed 3 nights a week, ever since Raphael bought it, and June began working there after her hospital shifts. Odessa Vanterpool slept inside the vehicle that night because the weather had turned cold, and because she was still more accustomed to sleeping near her old place than in the heated apartment someone had rented for her. At 2 o'clock in the morning, flames erupted from the rear of the vehicle. June was inside a tarp shelter, about 30 steps away. She woke to the sound of a plastic container exploding, and she ran. The rear door had warped from the heat, and she forced it open with her shoulder. Thick smoke poured downward, and the old woman was lying on the floor beside the medicine cabinet, struggling halfway upright and coughing. June grabbed the collar of her clothing. She pulled, and she pulled with both hands, with her right hand, and with the left hand that had lost 2 fingers during her first winter on the streets, the hand she had hidden inside her coat pocket in front of everyone for the past 3 years. That night, she didn't hide it. She dragged Odessa outside, down the step, away from the heat, and both of them collapsed onto the pavement just as the roof of the vehicle caved in behind them. In the emergency room that morning, both of Odessa's arms were bandaged to the elbows, and her face had turned gray from smoke inhalation. She took June's hand. In a voice roughened almost beyond recognition, she said, "Listen to me, child." She said she knew what June was thinking. She said, "Don't let this turn you into something like it." Then she closed her eyes and fell asleep. Raphael arrived at the scene before dawn had fully broken. He stood looking at the blackened frame of the vehicle, still steaming beneath the water from the fire hoses, his gray coat dusted with ash, a streak of soot across his cheek that he didn't wipe away. Then he took out his telephone. The first call lasted less than a minute. It went to a bank in the Caribbean, and he spoke only 3 sentences. He read the final 4 digits of an account, ordered it frozen, and reminded the person on the other end about something that had happened in a certain year that only the 2 of them knew about. The second call was to the president of the truck drivers union. He said he needed only one thing, that for the next 7 days, not a single truck would carry freight for Cormac Brisbane, through any port, any warehouse, or any route. The man on the other end named the amount of the losses. Raphael said he would pay every driver twice their lost wages, and he would pay with his own money without touching a single dollar belonging to the organization. The third call was the longest. He called a woman in Naperville, Brisbane's former wife, who had been divorced from him for 7 years. Raphael gave his name. He said he had just transferred a sum of money into her account, that it belonged to her whether she spoke to him or not, that he wasn't buying her. He was only returning what the other man had taken from her. The other end of the line remained silent for a very long time. Then she said she wouldn't keep it. She said she would transfer all of it to a shelter on the west side of the city. And then, without making him ask again, she told him where the ledgers were hidden, in a lakeside cabin in Michigan, beneath the 4th floorboard from the fireplace. She said she had waited 7 years for someone to ask her that question. Within 3 days, not a single bullet had been fired, and Cormac Brisbane's empire collapsed like a table after its legs had been pulled away. His accounts were frozen. His freight sat motionless at the port. His records were in the hands of a federal attorney, and the people who had once answered whenever he called no longer answered at all. The morning after the fire, June went to the foundation's supply room and took out a tracking bracelet, the small plastic kind the clinic gave to patients who often became lost, people with fading memories, people who couldn't remember where they had slept the night before. She fastened one around her left wrist. Then she required every member of the clinic staff to wear one as well. Without exception, someone asked why the staff needed them. June answered simply. She said that if she made her patients wear one while refusing to wear one herself, then she was telling them that her life was less worth finding than theirs. She said she couldn't say that to anyone. The replacement medical clinic was parked at its familiar street corner, and June was locking the rear door at nearly 11 o'clock that night, the ring of keys still in her hand, when someone stepped out from behind a streetlight. No one was with him. That was the first thing June noticed, even before she realized what he was holding. There was no car waiting, no second man standing at the end of the street. There was only a man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled, tailored suit, his hair damp and clinging to his forehead, and when he told her to come with him, his voice trembled so badly that he had to repeat himself. That same night, on the 4th floor of St. Bridget Medical Center, Odessa Vanterpool couldn't sleep. Her 2 bandaged arms ached dully, and she lay staring at the ceiling for a long time before pressing the call button for the young nurse working the night shift. She asked the nurse to open the Foundation's tracking screen on the tablet, and she gave a perfectly honest reason, saying she only wanted to know where the clinic was parked that night because she missed that street corner. The nurse opened it and propped the tablet against the pillow beside her. Odessa studied the map with its small glowing dots. Then she looked more closely. One of the dots was moving. It left the Well Street corner, traveled south, then turned into an area where none of their patients lived, where there were no shelters, no soup kitchens, nothing at all. She told the nurse to give her the telephone. Raphael answered after the second ring. Odessa read him the street name, the warehouse number, and the direction in which the glowing dot was moving. He asked how she could be certain. She said she had been a librarian for 31 years. She said her life's work had been knowing where things belonged, and more importantly, knowing when something was somewhere it shouldn't be. Raphael called the police before getting into the car. He gave them the address, said a woman was being held there, and ended the call. When the car stopped 1 block from the warehouse, Pell was already holding the thing he had carried for 19 years, but Raphael raised a hand to stop him. He removed the gray coat draped over his arm, leaving both hands empty, and said he was going in alone. Pell said going inside meant death. Raphael said the police were 9 minutes away. He said that meant he would have to speak very slowly. Inside the warehouse, only 3 lights were still burning above a wide, empty expanse of concrete. No one else was there. None of Brisbane's men, no vehicles, not even a chair set out. There was only Cormac Brisbane standing in the middle of that emptiness, June about 5 steps away from him, and his right hand trembling visibly. Raphael saw all of it in 2 seconds, and understood at once that this was far more dangerous than finding 20 armed men inside. A man who still had an organization, still calculated, still weighed what he might gain against what he might lose, and still had something with which to bargain. A man who had lost everything, had no brakes left at all. Raphael stepped into the light and spoke very slowly, even more slowly than usual. He said he was there now, and Brisbane could let her go. He said they could trade places. She would leave, and he would remain. And he spoke as though they were negotiating a term in a contract. Brisbane gave a dry laugh, and asked whether Raphael thought he needed him. Raphael said Brisbane needed someone, and Raphael was worth far more. He took another half-step forward, and June said no. She wouldn't leave. She remained exactly where she was, turned toward Brisbane, and spoke in the hollow, steady tone she used whenever the past resurfaced. She said she had lost her profession. She said she had lost her husband. She said she had lost 2 fingers during one winter. Then she said she had lost one more thing that she couldn't name there. She asked what else he thought he could take from her. The gunshot sounded louder inside that empty warehouse than it truly was. Raphael staggered half a step backward and collapsed, his right hand clutching his left shoulder, at the place where the line of swallow tattoos running down his forearm began. Brisbane stood frozen, staring at what he had just done, and June ran forward. She dropped to her knees on the concrete, tore the gray wool coat from Raphael's arm, crushed it into a thick bundle, and pressed it down with both hands, her right hand and the hand missing 2 fingers, forcing the full weight of her body through her straightened arms. She didn't look at the wound. She looked into his face. She told him to look at her, to look right here, and she told him to count with her. 1, 2, 3. He counted with her, his voice breaking between the numbers. She counted louder and more steadily, never taking her eyes from his for even a second. And that was how the 2 of them continued counting together on the cold concrete floor, while behind them, Cormac Brisbane slowly sank down and placed the gun on the ground, as though setting down something too heavy to carry. At the 9th minute, red and blue lights swept across the warehouse entrance. The hearing took place on an April morning, inside an administrative building in Springfield, in a room with gray carpeting, a long table stretching across the front, and 7 people seated behind it with open files before them. There were no reporters. No one waited in the hallway outside. Matters like this were never loud, and that was precisely why they could happen in the first place. June sat in the row reserved for the respondent, wearing the blouse Sabine Corvallo had bought for her the week before, her left hand resting openly on her lap, hidden nowhere. Raphael sat in the last row, his left arm still suspended in a sling across his shoulder. The door opened at 9:15. Wilhelmina Fox entered, 74 years old, leaning on an aluminum cane, her white hair gathered neatly into a bun, wearing the dark clothing people reserved for only two kinds of occasions. She moved very slowly down the aisle between the rows of chairs. Pell had visited her home 4 times, and during the first 3 visits, she had closed the door. On the 4th, she invited him inside, made a pot of tea, and listened to everything. She hadn't accepted a single cent from anyone. Not from Raphael, not from the attorney, and not from the foundation. She said she had come because she wanted to come. She lowered herself into the chair before the microphone, adjusted it with a trembling hand, and began to speak. She said that 3 years earlier, she had been the head nurse on duty that night. She said she had been inside the room, had seen the original physician's order, and knew who had written it. She said that the following morning, she had been summoned to the personnel office, given an agreement, and had signed it. She said she signed because she had only 14 months left before retirement and needed that pension, and she spoke those words without offering a single excuse. Then she said the part that silenced the entire room. She said she had remained silent for 3 years, and during those 3 years, she had allowed a young woman of 24 to carry the blame for a man whose name was engraved on the door of the 7th floor. She said she was 74 years old now. She said she didn't want to carry that truth with her when she left this world. Thaddeus Vance wasn't present. His license had been suspended the previous month, and he was now answering for another matter in another building. No one in the room mentioned his name more than twice. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. When they returned, the person seated in the center read the decision, and it was so brief that June nearly failed to hear all of it. Juniper Ashcomb's nursing license was fully reinstated, without conditions and without a probationary period. At the end of the document, there was one additional sentence, read aloud with effortless smoothness. The board acknowledges that errors occurred during the original investigative process and regrets the resulting impact upon the respondent. 19 words. June remained still. There was no applause because people didn't applaud in rooms like that. Sabine Corvallo turned and gently squeezed her wrist. The clerk carried the written decision down and offered it to her with both hands, and June received it with both of hers. Then she stood and walked into the hallway. The corridor was covered in gray carpet, with several artificial plants and a row of upholstered chairs placed against the wall. She sat in the first chair, rested the paper on her lap, and looked down at it. 19 words. She read them again, then read them once more, trying to place them on a scale against 3 years, trying to see whether they could cover that many winters, that many nights beneath a blue tarp, that many mornings spent standing in line in the snow. They couldn't. They only lay there, 19 typed words on a sheet of white paper, neat and grammatically correct. Her breathing began to shorten, and June Ashcombe did what she had done for the past 3 years, whenever everything inside her began to drift away. She counted. 1, 2, 3. She counted the bricks in the wall across from her, slowly and evenly, missing none of them, and she continued until her chest opened again and her breathing returned to normal. She didn't cry. Then she folded the paper, slipped it into her coat pocket, and stood to find Wilhelmina Fox so she could thank her. Rosalind Holt began to awaken in early May, and she didn't return in the way people usually imagine, with no sudden moment when someone opened her eyes wide and called her child's name. She came back little by little, like water receding from a field, able to move one hand one day, swallow solid food the following week, and speak 3 words the week after that before exhaustion pulled her back into sleep. By the middle of the month, she could sit propped against pillows. And one afternoon, while June was arranging several notebooks on the table beside the bed, Rosalind spoke, her voice rough but clear. She said June had thought she was reading to an old woman who couldn't hear a thing. June's hand stopped. Rosalind said she had heard everything. She said she couldn't open her eyes, couldn't move, couldn't do anything at all, but she could hear. She said she had listened every night to that steady voice, to that notebook, to those words written for someone who could no longer receive them. She said she had lain there listening to a mother speak to her child, night after night, and that was why she had come back. She said she had returned because she wanted to tell June that someone had been listening. June stood motionless in the middle of the room, still holding the notebook in both hands. Then Rosalind continued, and she spoke of the heavier part. She said she had also heard the night her son sat outside in the hallway. She said the door had been left slightly open, and she had heard everything from beginning to end, including the part about a check and the question he hadn't asked. She remained silent for a very long time, and when she spoke again, her eyes were wet. She said that for the past 3 years, she had been living on something taken from another person without ever knowing it. She said she had learned to walk again, taught 2 more classes of students, and celebrated Christmas with her son 3 times, and all of those things existed on this side of a door, while someone else had been pushed to the other side. She said she didn't know how to give any of it back. 3 weeks later, when she was strong enough to sign documents, she sold the house on the south side. It was the house with the piano whose yellowed keys sat half a note out of tune, the house where she had taught for 40 years, where the tin box had rested on top of the piano. She transferred every dollar from the sale into the foundation. She didn't ask her son's opinion, and by the time he learned about it, everything had already been completed. He said nothing. Then, one afternoon near the end of the month, Rosalind asked June about the song. She meant the one with 4 lines. She asked June to sing it for her again. June sang 4 lines, slowly and softly, exactly as she had on that winter night. Rosalind closed her eyes and listened until the end, then opened them and asked where June had learned it. June said she hadn't learned it anywhere. She said she had made it up herself. She said that 3 years earlier, her daughter had been lying inside an incubator after being born far earlier than expected, and they wouldn't allow June to hold her. They only allowed her to reach through the round opening and touch the little girl's foot. She said she had sat there through many nights and needed a song, but she didn't know any, so she created one. She said it had only 4 lines, because 4 lines were all she had been able to think of then. She said it didn't have a name. Rosalind asked her to bring the leather-bound music notebook and the pencil tucked inside it. She told June to sing again, slowly, 1 line at a time. Then, that 71-year-old woman, who had only regained the ability to hold a pencil less than 2 weeks earlier, rested the notebook on her knees and began to write the music down. She wrote slowly, her hand trembling, stopping several times to draw the clef, count the rhythm, and place each note carefully upon the staff. June sang those 4 lines again and again while Rosalind wrote. When she had finished, the old woman lifted the page to examine it, corrected 1 mark in the 3rd measure, and handed it to June. She said now it had a name. She said now it existed on paper, and things written on paper didn't disappear anymore. They could be copied, passed on to someone else, played somewhere far away on a day when neither of them was still there. Raphael stood in the doorway. No one knew how long he had been there, 1 arm still resting in a sling, watching the 2 women bent together over a page of music, his mother and the woman whose life he had crossed and shattered without ever knowing it. And Raphael Holt cried. No one saw him. He didn't wipe the tears away. The foundation called Spring Oak was established at the beginning of that summer, and it had 2 branches. The first was named for Harold Kettleman and was dedicated to healthcare workers who had been driven from their professions because they spoke a truth someone else wanted, kept silent. The second was called Marlowe House, a row of homes on the west side of the city where struggling mothers could have an address, a warm place to sleep, and enough time to regain their footing beside their children. Odessa Vanterpool joined the advisory board, and during its first meeting, she said she was still doing exactly the same work she had done for 31 years. Only the room had changed. June declined every invitation to return to the major hospitals. She accepted the position of nursing director for the mobile clinic team, and when people asked why, she said 3 years on the streets had taught her something nursing school never had, that people rarely died because they lacked medicine. They died because no one saw them. Raphael went to a tattoo shop in Pilsen, but not to add another swallow. He lay face down and told the artist to begin tattooing leaves onto the bare oak tree across his back, starting with the lowest branch and moving upward, each leaf representing 1 person the foundation had managed to save before it was too late. The center's small concert took place on a September afternoon in the common room overlooking the courtyard. A child of about 7 sat at the old piano and played 4 short, slow lines of music, stumbling slightly in the 3rd measure. Rosalind sat beside the child on a high stool and turned the page of music. No one in the room knew where the piece had come from. Everyone applauded. In the hallway after the concert, Raphael stood beside a window and removed the silver ring from the little finger of his left hand. He showed it to June. Then he told her something he had never told anyone. He said it wasn't his mother's ring. It had belonged to the father who walked out of their South Side apartment one morning and never returned. He said he had searched for that man for 15 years, paid the finest people he could find, followed every false name, and when he finally located him, he was already several months too late. The only thing left behind in a motel room in Indiana was that ring. He said he didn't keep it because he loved the man. He kept it to remind himself that a father could walk out of his child's life without any great reason at all. All he had to do was open the door and leave. He said he had worn it for years, so that every day he would remember the person he was trying not to become. Then he walked to the wooden donation box at the end of the hallway and dropped the ring inside. He didn't look back. Afterward, he turned toward her. He didn't make a long speech. He said he knew who he was and knew what he had done. He wasn't asking her to forget any of it, but he wanted to ask her one question, and he asked it. June remained silent for a long time. Then she said no. She said not now. He asked whether it was because of who he was. She shook her head and said no. It was because of who she was. She said that for the past 3 years, she had survived by holding on to other people, holding on to Odessa beneath the bridge, holding on to the notebook, holding on to a shoelace, then holding on to his mother, and then holding on to him. She said she needed to know who she was when she wasn't holding on to anyone at all. She said, "Give me 1 year." Raphael nodded. He didn't ask whether she would come back, because he understood that was a question meant for him, not for her. And he already knew his answer. 13 months later, on a November afternoon beneath the Wells Street Bridge, a mobile medical clinic pulled to a stop and opened its rear doors. June stepped down wearing a white coat and a name badge, her left hand resting naturally at her side. She walked over to where Raphael was sitting on a plastic crate and handed him a cup of coffee. He said she was 1 month late. She said she had needed to renew her resuscitation certification. Then she sat beside him. On the plastic chair nearby lay the small note she had left after the previous shift, bearing the words she had written for 3 years to people she had never met, that today you survived, and that isn't a small thing. This story leaves us with something very simple. A person's worth isn't measured by what they possess, but by what they manage to preserve after everything has been taken from them. The greatest sin of power often isn't cruelty, but the habit of never asking about those who stand beneath it. And sometimes, the thing that saves a human life isn't money or machinery, but a pair of eyes willing to stop long enough to truly see someone. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did this story make you feel? Which moment will remain with you the longest? And have you ever met someone who entered your life at exactly the moment you needed them most? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.